Inscriptions on tombstones, when interpreted, provide background information for fascinating analyses of societies, not just in aspects of how we celebrate the dead or the rituals we use for death, but in a broader and more comprehensive way. They provide collective perspectives on world views at given points in time, and they reflect the cultural aspects of the people who created these monuments or mementos. Of course, there is the obvious point that people immediately understand, such as genealogies, but far beyond this, they provide us with an intellectual discourse of the way previous societies have seen the world in which they lived, how they related to that broader view, and how this was played out. Tales from the Tombs.
Hello and welcome to Tales from the Tombs. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. In our first program from the Church of St. James, we dedicated the entire segment to those men and women who worked during the 1980s restoring and preserving this church. We also honor those who are today engaged in that continuous restoration project. Special emphasis was placed on the tour guides who take pride in showing visitors around this church on a weekly basis. Today we shall present to you just perhaps a glimpse of what was restored back in the 1980s. Our tour guide historian Dr. Carl Watson is standing by in the nave of the church.
As was the case with many of the Anglican churches of the island, the central nave of the church is characterized by a number of ledgers to people who played a role in Barbados' previous history. On this particular ledger, this blue ledger, for example, which is covered by the carpet, this is a tombstone to Samuel Barwick. The Barwicks were a well-known planter family, prominent in Barbados in the 17th and 18th century. And this particular Samuel Barwick was celebrated in death as the commander-in-chief of the island. He was head of the Council of Barbados, and he was also leader of the resident military forces or the local militia on the island.
This is one of the most important memorial tablets in St. James Parish Church and in Barbados, in fact, of all of our churches, because it is the tablet to a really intensively conscientious, hard-working, committed, patriotic Barbadian, Sir John Gay Alleyne. Not
Sir John Gay Alleyne himself, whose precise burial place, although we suspect it is in the church, it has not been located. But this plaque commemorates the wives and the children of Sir John Gay Alleyne.
And it says it's sacred to the memory of Dames Christian and Jane Abel, successively the consorts of Sir John Gay Alleyne. And it goes on to say, women in whose praise encomium has to borrow no false colouring from flattery, and of whom no language can describe the loss. And it goes on in those rich terms, and then it comes down to his son, the eldest of 7 sons, John Gay Newton Alleyne, a boy of hopes commensurate to the fondest wishes of a father. In 13 summers, it says, was too ripe for immortality, for longer continuance on earth. The afflicting intelligence of his death at Eton School at the age of 13. And then it concludes with the mournful erector of this threefold monument, because it was 2 wives and 1 son commemorated with this lovely piece of bas-relief sculpture showing a mother and 3 children playing, one of them with a lyre. This is almost as moving a piece as that of Sir Richard Westmacott's to Elizabeth Pinder in St. John's Parish Church.
The Alleynes inherited Nicholas Abbey through marriage with a member of the Dottin family, and as was customary in the 18th century, upon the marriage, the property of the wife passed under the control of the husband. So that's how the Alleynes came into possession of St. Nicholas Abbey. Sir John Gay Alleyne justly celebrated on Barbados for a number of reasons. His political contribution to the island. For example, he was the first Speaker of the House to claim parliamentary privileges for the Speaker of the House of Assembly. He was also the founder of the Alleyne School.
Sir John Gay Alleyne was made a Baronet of Four Hills, St. Peter, on April 6, 1769. Mount Gay Distilleries Limited, here in St. Lucie, makers of the world's oldest known rum brand still in existence, and the entire area known as Mount Gay, were both renamed from their previous names Mount Gilboa Plantation Distillery and Mount Gilboa in honor of Sir John Gay Alleyne.
If we go back a bit to the history of the Alleynes on the island, one of his forebears, Reynold Alleyne, supported the Cromwell forces, or the Commonwealth side, during the English Civil War in the late 1640s. Reynold Alleyne, actually with a number of Cromwell supporters, left the island and went to England to amass support to come to take Barbados from the Royalist planters who declared independence for Barbados. Reynold Alleyne was himself injured in battle with a musket shot to the head, and he died subsequently. But that's just the first Alleyne on the island, a whole series of Alleynes who played an important role in many aspects of Barbados' history. But certainly the most celebrated member of the Alleyne family, from looking at it from a holistic perspective, would be another John Alleyne. I don't know how many Barbadians are aware of the fact that young John Alleyne was a trained lawyer in England, and he himself played a major role in the struggle that eventually ended the slave trade and led to the abolition of slavery. John Alleyne was the lawyer chosen by Granville Sharp to defend the slave Somerset in the very famous case in English jurisprudence that established for the first time that slavery was illegal in England, and this was the foundation block, the building stone for the eventual onslaught both on the slave trade and then the Emancipation Act itself of 1834. So I think Barbadians can be proud to say that a Barbadian, a young Barbadian lawyer, played a major role in ending slavery. His burial place is in London because, of course, as a young man, he was born on a plantation not far from here, but he was educated in London. He went to the Temple. He was admitted to the bar. I would hope, and I would perhaps like one day to see a plaque in this church saying that in this church where young John Alleyne worshipped, this young Barbadian who went on to become a lawyer in England played the important role, and then the nature of his role explained. Because, as I said, both Barbadians and visitors alike, I'm sure, would welcome the opportunity to learn something about the contributions of this young man who died in his early 20s, died of tuberculosis. His aunt, because his mother was a Downs from the parish of St. Thomas, but young John Alleyne's aunt married the son of Benjamin Franklin. So we have there an interesting connection with the young United States of America. The iconography of the plaque itself is interesting. Again, it follows the typical neoclassical or neo-Grecian motifs of the funerary architecture of the time, with its supporting columns and with the iconography of the grieving widow with the children, the muses, the urn representing death. All of these plaques, which were sculpted by some of England's major sculptors of the time, and brought out to Barbados themselves constitute a large body of tangible funerary heritage, which again is very important and which lends to the appeal and the ambience of the church itself. And this plaque commemorates another one of the Alleens of the parish, Henry Alleen, who was also a member of the House Assembly for several years. There's an interesting story attached to the hour of his death, actually, because he was one of the many Barbadians killed on board the steamship, the Amazon, which caught fire in the Bay of Biscay with almost total loss of life. But the family tradition goes that at Porter's, which, as I've mentioned, was the Alleen property and where Henry Alleen lived, at the hour of his death on board the Amazon, many thousand miles away, his favorite dogs at Porter's howled and howled inconsolably. And the family knew that something was wrong, because these dogs never behaved that way. But they got the sad news some days later that Mr. Alleen had died in this fire. I don't know whether that story is apocryphal or not, but it's an interesting story.
This plaque, situated here next to the southern entrance of the church, is set like a theatrical piece, with the opening curtain revealing perhaps Act 1, Scene 1 of a play. And that play is the epitaph bearing an inscription about the life of Samuel Husbands, whose name today dignifies a community in the southern section of the parish of St. James.
The Husbands were again a very important planter family of this area, and Husbands, the place name's Husbands, takes its name from this particular family. And among the qualities used, and I wanted to focus on this, he is described as a patriot. Now, many of these early planter families, from the middle of the 17th century on, although they were of English origin, they were very proud of being Barbadian and considered themselves, first of all, Barbadian before they were anything else. That is why so often these people who were public servants at their point in time, or who espoused political positions that articulated for a extension or retention of the fairly extensive autonomy that Barbados, even though Barbados was theoretically a colony, we should remember that Barbados was never a crown colony. And that's a politically significant and important point of view. So that's why Husbands is represented here in this funerary plaque as being a patriot, meaning that he was a patriot to the interest of Barbados as opposed to the interest of the broader British Empire. And again, it speaks to the very pronounced early nationalism or proto-nationalism of many of these members of the ruling planter families of the day. And here we have this large and interesting funerary plaque to Edward Jordan. The plaque itself is an interesting composition. It's dramatic, unlike the white marble of most of the other funerary plaques in here. This is set against a background of black marble, so it stands out with the gold lettering. Like most funerary plaques, it's a deliberate construction that shows a sort of a theatrical opening with the hung curtains over the urn, and then the epitaph to Edward Jordan and his wives, with their coat of arms. And the sculptor, this is sculpted by W. Patty of Bristol, one of the better known of the English or British sculptors of the 18th century. This was sculpted in the very late 18th century. The Jordans, again, one of these very interesting families that Barbados has thrown up over time. But probably the most interesting of the Jordan family was Gibbs Walker Jordan, who, besides being the agent, or one would think of him today as the High Commissioner of Barbados to England, Gibbs Walker Jordan was a scientist in his own right, and he had revised some of the physics relating to optics advanced by Newton, the great Newton. And in fact, Gibbs Walker Jordan's publications in the early 19th century were translated into every single European language, and he achieved considerable fame at this point of time for correcting some of the arguments advanced by Newton regarding the properties of light as were applied to optics and the development of the science of light refraction and related areas.
There were many priests of St. James Parish Church, and this is a memorial tablet to one, the Reverend Francis Fitchett, M.A., Master of Arts, formerly Fellow of St. John's College, Cambridge, and most of our priests in those days came out from Oxford or Cambridge. He was the chaplain to the House of Assembly in Barbados, as well as being the parish priest here, and he was rector for 25 years.
And as often is the case with so many of these funerary plaques, they record some of the achievements and give a biography of the individual being celebrated here. So it tells us that he was rector of a number of churches, including St. Joseph's, St. Peter's, and St. James Parish Church. He also had a school for children of the parish. Between these two large Greek-inspired figures is a representation of the Reverend Fitchett himself. And of course, as typical of the 18th century, late 18th century approach to eulogies and epitaphs, it talks about his eloquence, it talks about how effectively he shepherded his flock, it talks about his contribution to education in the parish, talks about his benevolence and his charity.
It's one of those wonderful descriptions of a man who sounded like a saint. In this distinguished character were united fine abilities, extensive learning, and every moral virtue and Christian grace that could adorn the man and the divine. The sacred truths of Holy Writ he taught with persuasive eloquence, exemplified in his conduct, and in the pastoral office approved himself the faithful shepherd of his flock.
After residence of 28 years in the island, he was suddenly summoned hence to the pure joys of a better world.
This is another splendid marble monumental tablet, and this one is to Anne, the wife of the Reverend Dudley Woodbridge. Now, Woodbridge owned Porter's, and Porter's is one of only two great houses in Barbados which had its own private chapel. Behind the house is this lovely little chapel with a tablet there to the Woodbridge family, and she died in 1739. So this is one of the ancient tablets which was saved and reconstructed here after the rebuilding and extension of the church in 1874. This screen separating the main church from the chancel was actually erected in 1926, and it was given by Dr. Eustace Pilgrim. Now, Dr. Eustace Pilgrim was a doctor who made good, came back to Barbados, bought Porter's plantation, and was a benefactor of the church. And his memorial tablet is on the wall over here. Dr. Eustace Graham Pilgrim, MB of Portage St. James. Now, I said before, it's such a small place, Barbados, and such a small world. My father worked as overseer at Portage Plantation for Dr. Pilgrim, of whom he was extremely fond. And he worked there for 6 years, from the age of 18 to the age of 24, for Dr. Eustace Pilgrim. He finally sold the property, and it became the property of the Guinnesses. But Portage's house actually had 2 tennis courts, and the Portage Tennis Club allowed people to play tennis on these courts in or at Dr. Pilgrim's home. And my mother used to play tennis at that home, and she actually won the Mixed Doubles Cup of 1937, and I have that cup in my house, a lovely giant challenge trophy.
Here we are in the beautiful external part of St. James Parish Church, its graveyard. Very tranquil, peaceful, full of these monuments and houses to the departed. Beautifully treed, lovely atmosphere. One of the tragic things about these past funerary monuments is, as you can see, the inscriptions and the plaques that tell us who was buried in any particular spot. Very often, if they're 300 years or older, they succumb to the ravages of time. And it's fortunate that we have books such as these. This one, monumental inscriptions in the tombstones in the island of Barbados. Because although the identity of the people buried here has disappeared, we go back to this book written just over 100 years ago, and we learn that in this house-like structure, the Thornhill family were buried here. And they, of course, occupied the whole range of forms and styles, a family plot, a raised funerary monument surrounded by railings. We can look at some that are flat ledgers lying in the ground. When people commemorate death, they employ a wide range of styles to be used to commemorate their loved ones. On this flat ledger is commemorated Elizabeth Spark, one of the first settlers to come out to the island, who died almost 341 years ago. She died the 15th of October, 1672. Yes, 341 years ago. Again, much of it is obliterated, but there's enough of the inscription that remains, plus the documentation in this book by Oliver that confirms this is the burial place of Elizabeth Spark, burying the family's armorial bearings with an interesting touch, which almost certainly was added after her death, a skull below the armorial escutcheon of the Spark family.
Here at St. James Church, there are not many tombs, and as you saw earlier, many of the tombs have no inscription.
We haven't got a clue who is buried here, but this is a wonderful example of a beautiful piece of masonry. It must have been the tomb of someone who was very well-to-do in the early days of sugar wealth in the late 17th century, but there's no inscription on it, and we have no idea who this wonderful wealthy man or woman or family would have been. Now, in the old days, a lot of people were buried under the church, in vaults under the church, and paving stones often were used to commemorate them, particularly at St. John's and St. George's. And this little marble tablet commemorates the site of the Austin family vault. The Austins were prominent in St. James, and there are memorial tablets inside of the church, and one of them was actually parish priest here. This little enclosure holds the graves of the famous Aline family of the north. The Alines owned properties in St. Peter and St. James and St. Andrew, and they were to this northern end of the island, rather like the Skeets of St. Philip and the Hayneses of St. John. Sir John Gay Aline, of course, was the most famous of all of these Alines. They left their name in Allendale Hall, but in the 19th century, they were very prominent in St. James, and they occupied quarters across the way from the church. So within the enclosure are a number of graves and some tablets on the walls.
These 7 ledgers are dedicated to separate members of the Aline family, or Alines who had married into other families but who wanted to be buried in their family plot. We have Willin, and they'd actually moved to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but she is buried here in Barbados. Mrs. Gibbs, she was born in Aline but married a Gibbs. And then in the wall, of course, plaques to many other members of the Aline family who are all buried in this enclosure.
I rather like this one, Mrs. Margaret Elizabeth Gibbs and Aline, who was the late wife of the Reverend Haynes Gibbs. And next to her was John Forster Aline, a member of the council. So he was the Honourable John Forster Aline. He died in 1823, she in 1775. So you can see the age of these tombs. This is probably the most recent grave with a marked tombstone in St. James Parish Churchyard. And this is a Mr. Boyle. And I chose this particular grave just because A, it's one of the most recent before the cemetery took all of the St. James parishioners, and B, because Boyles are not a common family name in Barbados, but there was a Boyle who trained in medicine at St. Bartholomew's Hospital and invented an anesthesia machine for administering anesthetics in surgical cases. And that Boyle's machine remained the main method of giving anesthetics for nearly 100 years. A Boyle from Barbados. One of the reasons why St. James Churchyard is so beautiful and there's so much grass and so few tombs and graves is in fact because the water table here is just below the surface. In the early days, graves may have been rather shallow, but eventually they reached the point where they said the water table is so close to the surface, so they literally stopped burying people here and created the cemetery on the other side of Whole Town, just up the hill. But Canon Hatch had the brilliant idea of a memorial garden. And right here, we're standing by this garden that was created just 2 decades ago, and in which people who have been cremated have a memorial tablet. So you can actually pick a spot and reserve one of those tiles for your memorial. And I think we can go inside and see some of the people who have already taken up that offer.
Well, having read the names of those who have been immured here and those still alive who have opted for the immurement of their ashes in this Garden of Remembrance, we say goodbye to the historic St. James Parish Church with its beautiful funerary architecture, restored plaques and vaults. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, I appreciate your stay with me. Do join us next week at the same time when we conclude the first series of Tales from the Tombs. Good evening.